Have you ever noticed how some people seem to rise quickly? Not because they are the most skilled, but because they know exactly what to say and when to say it, while others who quietly do the real work slowly fade into the background without recognition. It makes you wonder what truly matters in the long run, impression or ability. Because sooner or later, there comes a moment when words stop working, and only real skill remains. At a fast-growing company, two employees worked in the same department, Mark and Ethan. On the surface, they were just colleagues, working toward the same goals, but in reality, they were completely different in how they approached their work and their place in the organization. Mark had a very specific kind of intelligence. It wasn't technical expertise or deep problem-solving ability, but rather social awareness. He understood people. He knew how to position himself in conversations, how to speak with confidence, even when he wasn't entirely sure, and most importantly, how to make the right people feel important. Every morning, before even settling at his desk, Mark would walk into the boss's cabin with a friendly smile and perfectly timed compliments. He would say things like, "Great leadership in yesterday's meeting, sir," or "That strategy you suggested was brilliant." And the interesting part was that it never sounded fake. It felt natural, almost effortless, and over time it built a strong impression. During meetings, Mark was always among the first to speak. While others were still thinking, he would confidently say, "I completely agree with your vision," or "We should move in that direction." His tone carried certainty, and people tend to trust certainty, even when it lacks depth. Slowly, almost without anyone consciously noticing, Mark became the boss's favorite.
Ethan, on the other hand, lived in a completely different rhythm. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, and he didn't believe in interrupting or trying to dominate conversations. Instead, he spent his time understanding problems deeply. He would sit quietly, observing discussions, identifying gaps, and thinking through solutions in a structured way. Most evenings, long after the office had emptied, Ethan would still be at his desk, a single light glowing beside him, working through technical issues that others either overlooked or didn't fully understand. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply cared about doing things right. But there was one problem Ethan never addressed: visibility. His work was valuable, but it remained unseen. And in a workplace, unseen value often becomes invisible over time. Mark, whether intentionally or instinctively, took advantage of this. Whenever Ethan tried to explain something in discussions, Mark would casually interrupt with a light tone, saying, "You're overthinking it," or "Let's not complicate things." Sometimes he even joked in meetings, saying, "Don't worry about Ethan's ideas. He tends to go too deep into technical details." The room would laugh, not out of malice, but because confidence is easier to follow than quiet correctness. What no one realized was that Mark was paying very close attention to Ethan. He understood that Ethan had real solutions, and many times he would listen carefully when Ethan explained something informally. Later, in a different setting, Mark would present the same idea as his own. He would walk into the boss's office and say, "I've been thinking about this issue," and then clearly explain the solution with confidence. The delivery made all the difference. The boss would nod, impressed, and respond, "Excellent thinking, Mark." And just like that, credit shifted. Over time, this pattern repeated itself so often that Mark became known as the problem solver, the rising star, the one everyone trusted. Meanwhile, Ethan remained in the background, quietly doing the work that built those solutions.
One evening, when the office had almost emptied, an older colleague named Victor noticed Ethan still working. Victor had spent decades in the industry and had seen enough situations like this to understand what was happening. He walked over and asked a simple question: "Why do you keep giving your ideas away?" Ethan looked slightly surprised and replied honestly, "I thought that's what teamwork means." Victor smiled, but his expression carried a deeper understanding. He said, "Teamwork doesn't mean becoming invisible. Some people build success through effort, and others build it by collecting credit. If you don't connect your work to your name, someone else will. Then he added something that stayed with Ethan. Next time, don't just solve the problem, present it yourself. A few weeks later, the company secured a massive international project. It was the kind of opportunity that could define the company's future, and everyone knew the stakes were high. The CEO personally announced it, emphasizing that failure was not an option. As expected, Mark was chosen to lead the project. He had the reputation, the confidence, and the visibility. He accepted the responsibility without hesitation, assuring everyone that the team would deliver something extraordinary. Ethan was assigned to the technical side, working behind the scenes once again. The team worked intensely for weeks, preparing for the final presentation. There were long hours, constant revisions, and growing pressure as the deadline approached. Mark handled communication and presentations, while Ethan focused on solving the deeper technical challenges. This time, however, Ethan approached things slightly differently. He still worked quietly, but he made sure he fully understood every part of the system, not just to fix it, but to own it. The day of the final presentation arrived. The room was filled with senior executives, international clients, and the CEO himself. The atmosphere was tense, but hopeful. Mark stood confidently at the front, beginning the presentation with his usual composure. Everything seems to be going smoothly at first, but then, without warning, the system froze. A flicker appeared on the screen, followed by error messages that quickly took over the display. The demonstration had failed at the worst possible moment.
The room fell silent. The kind of silence that carries pressure. The CEO turned to Mark and said firmly, "You're leading this project. Fix it." Mark stepped forward, trying to maintain his confidence. But as the technical details were explained, it became clear that he didn't fully understand the issue. He attempted a few quick fixes, but nothing worked. The more he tried, the more uncertain he appeared. For the first time, his confidence had no foundation to stand on. Then, from the back of the room, a calm voice spoke. "I think I know what's causing it." It was Ethan. He walked forward steadily, without urgency or hesitation, and began analyzing the system. Within moments, he identified not just the error, but the underlying cause. He explained it clearly, in simple terms that everyone could understand, and then he fixed it. The system restarted, and this time, the demonstration worked flawlessly. The tension in the room lifted, replaced by relief and quiet admiration. The CEO looked at Ethan with a new perspective and asked, "Why didn't we hear from you earlier?" Ethan paused briefly before answering. "I used to share everything immediately, but I realized that if you don't take ownership of your work, it becomes invisible." The room remained quiet, but this silence was different. It carried understanding. That day changed the dynamics completely. Leadership was reassigned, and for the first time, Ethan was recognized for what he truly brought to the table. Mark, who had relied on impression, now had to face a reality where impression alone wasn't enough. Because in the end, flattery can create opportunities, but it cannot sustain them. When real challenges appear, when pressure builds and outcomes matter, only true skill remains. And sometimes, the most important lesson isn't just to work hard, but to make sure your work is seen, understood, and connected to you.